Good morning, Shabbat Shalom. It is such a joy to be here together on this cold, slushy, sleety, almost snowy morning. Uh, we have a treat today. We, we have a treat today. We're going to be looking into the story of Mordechai. And this is a moment I got a few emails after the teaser yesterday saying, how could you?
Not just emails.
Not just emails. It's true. How could you? Like, why take down Mordechai? Is this some sort of woke thing where you have to take down all of our heroes? And why do we have to reenact? Like, can't we just support this guy? He's been good for all of Jewish history. Like, why mess with him now? And so I just want to clarify. My goal is not to bash Mordechai here. It feels really important for us in this moment to be looking at our heroes and really evaluating why they are our heroes and how they are our heroes. And in the moments where we find heroes maybe behaving in ways that they shouldn't, that's a helpful reminder to all of us that no one is beyond redemption, that everyone has the possibility to rise and be a hero in every moment. And so my hope is that our learning about Mordechai is not just going to take him down in our minds, but is going to help us to elevate the potential for hope and possibility in our world, especially when we don't see it as possible. So let's start with our blessing. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kiddushanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah, v'ha'arevna Adonai Eloheinu et divrei Toratcha b'finu u'b'fi amcha beit Yisrael kulam.
We skip a whole bunch. Yes. Let's go again. V'arevna Adonai Eloheinu et divrei Toratecha
בפינו ובפי עמך בית ישראל, ונהיה אנחנו וצאצאינו וצאצאי עמך בית ישראל, כולנו יודעי שמך ולמדי תורתך לשמה, ברוך אתה אדוני המלמד תורה לעמו ישראל, ברוך אתה אדוני אלוהינו מלך העולם, אשר בחר בנו מכל העמים ונתן לנו את תורתו. Baruch atah Adonai notein haTorah.
The potential for redemption already here.
How many times have we done this blessing?
I was going to say, I think pregnancy brain is catching.
Just for you. You have a reason.
So I thought we would start out just by looking in the Megillah. And I want to just ask you how you see Mordechai in these various moments. So specifically the first moment, Mordechai is introduced to us in the following way. In the fortress of Shushan lived a Jew by the name of Mordechai, son of Yair, son of Kish, a Benjaminite. Kish had been exiled from Jerusalem in the group that was carried into exile along with, I'm going to skip. He was a foster father to Hadassah, that is Esther, his uncle's daughter, for she had neither father nor mother. The maiden was shapely and beautiful, and when her father and mother died, Mordechai adopted her as his own daughter. I just want to ask you, what do you see in that when you like? That's his Mordechai's being introduced. He walks up. This is his moment of hello. Here's Mordechai. What do you get from that?
Well, to begin with, it's a little tricky the question because I know it goes somewhere else afterwards. But it looks like a wonderful person, a wonderful human being who's taking care of his cousin, younger cousin who has no parents, and he, he's good. I like that.
I think you're fishing for the modern instinct would be to look for, why are they mentioning that she's shapely and beautiful? Is there something wrong here in this relationship? Is there something going on in this relationship that Mordechai is inappropriate? And I think, to me, that would be a misread of the text.
Yeah, I'm with you guys so far. Mordechai seems to be, a person who's actually doing something he doesn't necessarily have to do to take care of this person. So I think he's stepping up and being a good person.
I'm not trying to bash against Mordechai. I just want to go through the text. We're just going through the story. I just want to start at the beginning.
All right, cool. Can I put something on the table just before we start this whole class? I love this article you brought. I love this article.
Hold on, I get to ask the question.
No. Just to put it on the table, because you have the impression that you are the only one in favor of this. But This brought new light to me. I barely think about Mordechai. And I mean, I never thought much of him as a hero. I think the hero of the story is Esther, not Mordechai. But this new view on him, it's actually very good. I like it.
So let's go with that. Let's just follow that. What do you like about it, Elias? What stuck out for you?
Well, to begin with, I never understood quite correctly this idea that he's somebody who you could see as standing for his own values, all right? He won't give up any of his values, no matter what. So hiding his Jewishness, it's out of his question. But then he advises his cousin to hide her Jewishness. So it's kind of like, doesn't make sense. I'm fully invested in this or not, or why? Why am I telling? Is it better for her? Is it better for me in order eventually to gain some political power?
Yeah. To me, I don't love the gloss of this is all about Mordechai's selfishness and his drive for power, but I do love the complexifying here in the sense that, you know, all of us are full human beings. We have our good parts and our hard parts. And sometimes our hard parts are wound up within our good parts. And the piece of the article that really spoke to me was the piece of, you know, he sticks to his guns so strongly. And by doing that, he actually is causing challenges for the people. If he had been sort of more sophisticated, a little bit more nuanced, if he had been able to kind of see beyond his own faith principles that defined who he was, then maybe things would not have gone down the way they do.
But
in
Michelle,
the
let me ask
story.
you a question. You're having dinner with your kids at home. And you said, you start telling them stories about you growing up as a Jew, and you said to them, I never hide my Jewishness. All right?
It's pretty easy in Malibu, California.
Right, that's right. It wasn't the example for me. It wasn't my life experience. So, and then you said, I'm going to give you an advice. Normally, you would say, don't hide your Jewishness. But then all of a sudden, you advise your kids, hide your Jewishness.
So
Don't do what I
right.
do what I do what I say.
So I wonder about that moment in particular, the question of the shifting tide, right? When I was growing up, I never had a moment where I had to hide being Jewish. I could wear my Jewish star very proudly anywhere that I went. But as times change, I am mindful of there are places and spaces where, you know, somebody might say to a kid, wear a baseball hat instead. You don't necessarily have to have your kippah on in this moment because that might be dangerous. And there are other people who would legitimately say, no, I'm going to wear my kippah in that space. I'm going to tell you to wear your kippah in that space. And I think both choices are actually okay because they're both choices that speak to how we want to make sure that our children are safe and healthy in the world. So there are plenty of Orthodox Jews who say wear a baseball cap when you go to France. And that's a choice that sometimes people make that I don't think we ought to denigrate in this moment. And there are others who will say, no, dafka, when you go to France, make sure to wear your kippah.
So I want to jump in here because there's something very interesting that I hadn't noticed until this week with a very, very close reading. I always imagined that Mordechai deliberately placed Esther in the path of the king and to try to get her into the palace. But the text is very careful to specify that Esther was just taken into his harem. That it wasn't that Mordechai was like, okay, honey, we're going to get ready and we're going to go to the king's palace and you're going to try to be his wife, which has a problematic ring to it. Instead, that's maybe Esther's dream. Maybe that's Esther's plan for herself that Mordechai is not involved with. And so that becomes a place where it's a very interesting moment. And that aspect of Rava's criticism in the Talmud of Mordechai sort of falls apart a little bit for me because I see that in the sense of like a caring adult being like, okay, you've just chosen to enter yourself into a very dangerous situation. The king has just murdered his wife. He's all of these, like, this is not a stable individual. You do not want to give him any information that could cause him to hurt you. So that's a moment that I could see him as a parent. Now, that a little bit for me falls apart. There are a couple of moments that I want to talk about because there's something else that comes up. So if we look at the end of chapter 2, Mordechai is sitting at the palace gate, and he hears Bigtan and Teresh, two of the eunuchs of the king, are plotting to do away with King Achashverosh. And what's interesting to me about this is Mordechai hears about this and tells Queen Esther. And I just want to ask you, I just had this question, why tell Queen Esther and not report it through the proper channels? I'm guessing that women were not the proper channels for reporting such things in that time. No offense against women, just it didn't seem like that was the protocol. So what do you think is going on for Mordechai here?
Then we want to hear your opinion here.
Well,
you read the Megillah every year.
Yeah, I was going to say, well, maybe in terms of the channels, the person that he would have to report it to might have been Haman, but Haman hasn't been introduced till chapter 3. So so again, as you say, the ideas fall apart. So I'm not really.
And there's a special melody here, right, Dan? There's a unique melody that comes in this verse that's not it's out of the norm for the new song.
Out of the norm. It's the only time you ever hear that melody ever. It's anyway. So yes, that's right. So I'm not sure what's going on there.
What is that noise? There is no snow. There is almost no snow. What are they doing?
But I was thinking also a little bit earlier. In this text we're talking about the use of the word ish, which comes up in this article. Ish Yehudi and Haman is an ish, and then also thinking about the other times that term is used. For a person, and I think the Psalm Tefillah Moshe Ish HaElohim. So it's an interesting use of language that's noted very very nicely in this in the article that we had about the times how Haman and Abu and Mordechai are identified. The king is not Ish. The eunuchs, well, that's another question. They're not Ish anyway, but that's a complex question. But so why that terminology? And I think that's a really interesting point as well, and it connects to I think the power that we talk about in the power struggle that goes on. The other thing I was thinking about is the question you just asked about why doesn't Mordechai report it. I think it's already when he doesn't bow down, the people say to him, they don't say anything about his being a Yehudi. They just say, "Why are you disobeying the order of the king?" So maybe he's already got himself in a little hot water already.
Well, I just want to say, chronologically, we haven't gotten to the bowing scene yet.
Okay.
So in chapter 2,
that's right.
This just before the bowing scene. That comes afterwards. So there's this very interesting prelude. Mm-hmm. And I have such curiosity about what's going on there. Is he as a caring, protector trying to give Esther protexia from information that she's the one? What's interesting is later on in the book of Esther, we don't find that she's not the one that gets put down in the book of records as the reporter of this potential crime. Mordechai is. So there's something very interesting going on here. But let's go ahead to the bowing, because that's already coming up. I promise we're going to get to the... I just realized we needed some background. Sometime afterward, on the beginning of chapter 3, King Achashverosh promoted Haman, son of Hammedatha the Agagite, and advanced him and seated him higher than any of his fellow officials. All the king's courtiers in the palace gate knelt and bowed low to Haman, for such was the king's order concerning him. But Mordechai would not kneel or bow low. Then the king's courtiers who were in the palace gate said to Mordechai, "Why do you disobey the king's order?" This, of course, goes on to incite ire and wrath. How do you interpret this moment? What's going through Mordechai's mind?
Well, I don't know. I'm going to play a little bit of Michelle's role here on defending Mordechai here, because you like the traditional views of stuff. I think that on his defense, perhaps he was full of conviction not to bow, for Haman, but perhaps he didn't take in consideration the consequences of his act. He was acting only for himself. If he would have known that a man will do a decree to kill all the Jews in the town, he probably would have thought about this twice.
Right. We do have a tension in our tradition between the responsibility to do Kiddush Hashem, to say, I'm willing to die rather than commit idolatry, rather than to bow down to a secular person who perceives themselves as a god. And we have Uchai Bahem, right? You're supposed to live by them. You're not supposed to create a situation where we're going to be killed just because you didn't. I mean, nobody would say we shouldn't shake Haman's hand, but we would say you shouldn't bow down. And the rabbis do go to a fair amount of effort to try to understand this moment, right? Because there is no clause that you can't bow down before a secular king in a secular way. So it must be that he was wearing something on his lapel that showed another god to make it as if Haman was saying, if you bow down to me, you're bowing down to another god. And even so what that tells me, Rashi says, when we're studying Rashi, we always ask what's bothering Rashi. So what's bothering what's bothering the rabbis here is, wait a minute, right? Yes, we have this principle, but this probably wasn't the scenario that one would have employed this principle. So how do I understand it in a global way? And one of the questions we have that brings us deep discomfort as moderns is, how do we understand the zealotry of our heroes in some ways when we think about Hanukkah? Right? You think about the Maccabees and what we're celebrating when we're celebrating the Maccabees. It's a very different orientation to traditional Judaism than we have today, and yet they still remain heroes for us. And I think that the rabbis try to wrestle that out with Mordechai, complexifying him.
Yeah, it's a fascinating moment with the rabbis adding the lapel comment, because it feels like such a grasping reach, especially since we have got to imagine that Mordechai is bowing to the king all the time, that's a regular part of his royal practice, and that's never become a thing. And it also just feels like such interesting timing to me, like right after this revelation that there's instability and violence, and that there's, I know that Bigtan and Teresh were plotting to murder Achashverosh, but there is a sense that like there's violence in the air, that there's animosity in the air, and in that moment he becomes more antagonistic and more zealous. It's an interesting time frame to see that happening. And as a child, I always learned about this as like Mordechai the hero, that we should laud this. And I have a question, just like, how do we think about public statements? Because this in many ways feels like an Instagram, TikTok moment, right? Like you go to the museum and you throw soup on the picture, not because it's going to advance your agenda on global warming, but because it's going to draw a lot of attention. And how do we see Mordechai as sort of the attention-seeking
So let me ask
thrower?
you a question, because I never said this, but I grew up in a different country. And
Where? Wait, hold on. What?
I forgot about it already. When I went to Jewish day school, and I went to Jewish high school, and then involved in synagogue movements and everything, and life in synagogue. I was never taught that Mordechai was a hero. It was always the story of Esther. And so, were you taught that Mordechai was a hero? And to me, maybe because I come from another part of the world, but to me, always heroes were people who did something using their physicality, their physical strength. The Maccabees, the movies, the superheroes, and not somebody who, bows down or doesn't bow down. So to me, he was never a hero.
Yeah,
so can you tell me about your upbringing?
I agree with you in terms of my understanding of the Megillah. I always found Mordechai was the wingman, right? He kind of gets credited with setting up the stage in ways that enable and inspire Esther to bring out her true self. So yes, Mordechai is not the only. So it doesn't
how was for
bother
you,
me.
Keilat Israel, growing up?
For me, it was they were like co-heroes of the co-heroes. And Mordechai was he's like the director behind the scenes. Of course, Esther has to step up, but Mordechai is actually the hero for creating the plan and making it happen. So I think they always seem to be, and especially you always think about the very end of the Megillah, which we'll get to. I'm sorry,
He steals her thunder. No, we can talk about it now.
Okay.
What chapter are we now?
Well,
Yes, exactly. Right.
3, 4?
Right.
Chapter 10.
Chapter 10, yeah. But I want to, before we get there, there's one more moment I want to look at, and then I want to go to some of the text in the packet, which is, so Mordechai, after he finds out about Haman's reaction to his not bowing down, he goes around in sackcloth and crying and wailing. This is just a moment where I start to question him. It is like, what's his goal? Like, when he's going out in this, is it an authentic emotional reaction, or are we back to throwing soup at the paintings? How is he reading this? And then right after that, we have this moment where Haman passes him by in the streets, and knowing that Haman is angry and knowing that Haman has it out for the Jews, he still doesn't walk away. He doesn't do anything. He stands there and refuses to bow again. And so I just want to ask you, how do you see those two moments? Does that intensify your idea that he is being zealous and living up to his values? Does it feel like he plays an important role in terms of galvanizing support with the people and having the people all rise to the awareness that their identity matters and they should stand up for it? Does it feel like a stunt?
So there are so many historic moments in Jewish life that come to mind. When I went years ago to Spain as part of a Cantor's Assembly mission with a few temple members, we met with a local rabbi who told us that obviously for 500 years, from 1492 to 1992, Jews were not allowed to live in Spain. Can you believe it? 500 years. Anyways, story, aside, he says that he, as a Jewish rabbi in Madrid, he pays taxes to the church, right? It's mandatory for any citizen of Spain, regardless the religion, to pay taxes to the church, all right? What will happen with this rabbi if he refuses to pay, all right? It will be a disaster. And he, as a leader of the Jewish community, this idea of this act will bring consequences not only to him, but to the entire Jewish community. So he pays the taxes. So what I'm saying here is that perhaps it wouldn't be such a bad idea for Mordechai to bow down.
Yes, and that could have been a choice that one could argue for, right? And certainly many people have made it over many generations. And yet, when I think about this moment for Mordechai, I think about the Rosa Parks moment, right? And the movement that she starts. And you could say, well, why? Why would you do that? You could have just sat on the bus. And, or you could have just gotten up. What do you mean, right? Why did you have to dig in that moment? And none of us would ever question why she had to dig in that morning, of course, because that's a moment in which your dignity, in which your identity, in which your sense of justice in the world is affronted. And at least for the first scenario, right, I can see that Mordechai was in a moment where perhaps that was his Rosa Parks moment. And maybe in other circumstances, he might have done something different. But that day is no, I'm not going to do this. And yes, we do have to change our world to make space for this. And therefore, subsequent times, and certainly when other people then have all of the bus boycotts and all of the social activism that we had in the civil rights movements, nobody would look at that and say that there was anything selfish or untoward about that. That was the most authentic expression of human dignity. And I think you can read Mordechai through that lens as well.
I think there's a different read also, which is, and Elias, you're talking about superheroes, and oftentimes what you have is it's depicted as you have the alpha males, So I think we have two alpha males that are just having a blanking contest as part of this. I'm not going to bow down because I see myself not only equal to you, but maybe even better than you. And Haman is saying, well, that's and it's like this, just two people that see themselves, as chiefs, as the head, that don't want to, that we're not going to back down from each other. Elias, I was going to come back to one other thing that you said earlier about heroes. And I was thinking, like, the imagination is, people with super strength. And if you look behind you, you get the little mask on the bulletin board there, right? So I was thinking about, what about people like Schindler, that the way that he was a hero, and all of the righteous heroes that didn't do anything specifically physical, but just did like signing documents or hiding people, without like stepping up in front of Panzer tanks and trying to stop them. So that that's another way that a person can be a hero as well.
No question about it, and thank you for bringing that up. I was bringing my childhood experience. To me, my heroes were Samson in those days, Samson, the Maccabees, with the long hair. I try to imitate the long hair, but my Jufro would grow this way and not go down. But anyways.
I just want to come back to Michelle, I found your comment about Rosa Parks to be so fascinating, because there are two narratives when it comes to Rosa Parks. One narrative is that there was a lot of thought and premeditation into that moment, and that she got on that bus and they had picked her specifically because of who she was and what she looked like, and that she would be a sympathetic character, and that it was a planned, thoughtful action. And then there's also a school of thought that she just that day wasn't thinking of consequences and just no. And there's also, I think, a problem when we compare the civil rights movement to Mordechai, because the civil rights movement was asking for equal rights and equal privilege for every citizen. And Mordechai is not acting for equal rights. He's asking for specific special rights. He's asking to be different than all of the other people in Shushan and not to bow to Haman because he has a special identity. And so that's, I think, an important...
But I'm going to struggle with that for a second, because I do think that, at least as a Jew in the world, that asking for the right to be a Jew and to worship as you worship and to act in the world and to be in the world as we are actually is as well asking for an equal right. Mordechai's not getting up and saying, I want you not to worship your gods. He's saying, I want to not worship your gods. So to me, that's not asking for an extra privilege.
Mm-hmm. And I think that's where I confess to not buying the whole idol on the lapel thing. It just feels like, come on, that's going a little too far. I want us to look at, on the bottom of page 6, the Babylonian Talmud read of that moment. Michelle, would you read for us on the bottom of page 6?
Oh, I'd be delighted to. All right, which one's page 6?
Babylonian source number 7. I numbered it this time. Source number 7.
No,
is
I have a
6?
page 5 and a
Just
page
kidding,
7.
Page whatever source number 7 is, the Babylonian Talmud.
Perfect. That's actually page 9.
Then
right?
I must have printed a different source for myself. Sorry.
Okay.
Source number 7.
Source number 7. Moses. And the man, Moses, was exceedingly humble. Is that what you want?
No, here. Can I give you mine?
Sure.
Sorry. Babylon, this one.
Oh, it is on page 6 in yours. Okay. Once King Ahasuerus issued money to his heads of armies and dispatched them to conquer the province, Haman took his, and there did not remain anything. So when he came to spend it on his soldiers, he did not have anything left. He approached Mordechai because Mordechai was a professor of money. And the money was in Mordechai's hands, just as the king had issued it to him. Haman said to Mordechai, lend me from this money which is in your hand. Mordechai said to him, I will not lend to you unless you sell yourself to me as a slave. Haman accepted this upon himself, and Mordechai made him the loan. And he wrote a contract as follows. Haman, the slave of Mordechai, has sold himself to Mordechai for a loaf of bread. And this is what Mordechai says to Haman when Haman expects Mordechai to bow to him. When a slave acquires property, to whom does the slave belong? Therefore, to whom does the property belong? Therefore, Mordechai refused to bow to Haman because Mordechai thought it inappropriate to bow to his own slave. This is, by the way, the most anti-Semitic production of Jewish text that I have ever encountered.
I just found that to be such a wild story that I'd never come across.
We wrote this?
We wrote this. Yeah, I'm not. there are lots of moments that we wrote. Yeah. So I just found that to be such a wild read. And echoing, of course, the Jacob and Esau moment with the stew, which feels like a very interesting read that we were closer to Haman than we often like to think. Any other reactions to that text? No reactions.
I'm just thinking they were like, I don't know what they were drinking or at that moment they were drinking, so they didn't know the difference between Mordechai and Haman. I have no idea, but it's just like so far fetched, and right. And as I agree with you, Michelle, that Mordechai is the one with the money, and the idea that the Jews lend the money, and I mean, it's like it's so anti-Semitic.
Alisa, what do you think about that story? Because you are the one who brought it up.
And I apparently had a mishap on the source sheet. So the thing that's fascinating about it for me is that it puts a narrative behind that moment for Mordechai, and we don't actually hear his voice in thinking what was he thinking in that moment? Like that first moment when he doesn't bow down, what's going through his mind and what's their relationship like? We never get that. And Rava in the Talmud is very careful to compare them as equals, right? Ish and Ish. They're both men. They were both of the same debaucherous party. They're both doing the wrong things. And Mordechai, in Rava's eyes, Mordechai is just always jealous that Haman has advanced beyond him and that now he has to bow down. And this takes that to a whole other level in that they have sort of a relationship that's filled with animosity. But it colors for me, and I just have that question. I don't fully get resolution in terms of what's going through Mordechai's mind. He has the sensibility to advise Esther not to share her identity. He has the sensibility this is a dangerous time. He's aware of the violence going on, and yet in this moment he doesn't interpret halacha. He doesn't interpret all of the biblical stories where people are totally comfortable bowing down to other people. Where they don't have any conversation about what's on their lapels. Likelihood there's probably idols hanging out in those spaces and nobody has a problem with it. So why now? And I just found it to be a really interesting read. And I think, Elias, what you shared about growing up, that Mordechai wasn't your hero. I grew up in a very progressive community, and Mordechai was definitely the hero of the Megillah. The seminal moment of the Megillah is when he tells Esther, who knows if this was the reason why you're here? You were here for a reason. And then the ending, chapter 10, and this is the story of Mordechai, the hero. Mm-hmm. So it's just a fascinating moment.
So a couple of things I want to put on the table. You know well that there are some sources that says that perhaps this never existed, that this story never took place, that actually the story was really a Babylonian story with, I don't know how you pronounce it, but Xerxes was Ahasuerus, and Ishtar was Esther. All right. So looking at the ending of the Megillah, the moral of the story is: don't mess up with the Jews, because no Jew will be killed, because not even one Jew dies in the story. And hundreds of thousands of people will be killed as revenge. It's a little scary, the moral of the story.
In Mordechai's name and with his protection because he's so powerful.
Right. And I know that we don't want to get into politics here with Israel, but it could be scary times for Israel as well. This jealousy about, the leadership and how you envision the future of the country. But anyways, so the good thing is that, if you are Jewish and you like the story, let's celebrate Purim. Let's do, masquerade and parades and everything. But if you don't, blame the Babylonians. It's not a Jewish story.
I often wonder whether this is a serious text that was unintentionally funny, or whether it's meant to be a funny text that's unintentionally serious.
Yes, the answer is
right.
Yes.
The point is, if you look contextually what's happening in the world in those days, based on our knowledge, is that the temple got destroyed. All right? The Babylonians destroyed the temple maybe 100 years before this story. All right? And the Jews lived in the exile. All right? So nothing good was happening with the Jewish people in those days. All right? And this idea that a whole story, a plot, gets the happy ending, the Jews survive and nobody got killed, nobody got hurt, but we killed everybody, it's a little hard to swallow.
Well, and that's the point, that, it's such a fantasy that gone astray in a way that's ridiculous if you see it on one hand, and profoundly dangerous if you see it on the other.
Yeah, and the other weird thing is that we actually celebrate this every Shabbat. I mean, at the end of every Shabbat, like Yutim Aita Orav Simcha V'Sason V'Yikar, in Havdalah. So
look at that, Elisa. You brought the idea of destroying Mordechai. We destroyed Purim. We went even further.
Misha.
Even further.
I want to be fair to you, Elisa. You were not doing a takedown of Mordechai. Rava does the takedown of Mordechai. You are just the messenger here.
Well, and I think that's actually a really important piece, and that was something I really appreciated from Rabbi Ayalon Eliach, that the takeaway of Purim is not necessarily that there are clear-cut heroes or villains. That Rava's read of the reason to drink excessively is that we get too caught up in what we think is right and what we think is wrong, and that leads us to mistakes. And that leads us, Elias, you mentioned the situation in Israel, and I think that the settlers who are doing violence right now believe that they are doing the right thing. They believe wholeheartedly that going into Hawara and going into Arab villages and burning homes and destroying livelihoods and killing people, that is the right move. And that when we get too attached to being a hero, when we get too attached to Kiddush Hashem, when we get too attached to the right cause, that's when we are in most danger. And so Purim says to us, don't take for granted what you believe. Don't believe that everything you've been told is right. You really have to question. And you have to ask that question, is this a funny story that's unwittingly serious, or a serious story that's unwittingly funny? What do we have to do? And that's, I think, a really important question, particularly today, when the act of questioning, the act of consideration, the act of thoughtfulness is demonized to such an extent.
That's beautiful. And the other thing, we didn't really get to the idea of drinking, so know the difference between Mordechai and Haman. So I heard 3 days ago on the news that human beings have been, they've just figured out, have been making wine for almost 11,000 years. So seriously, think about that. So the power of alcohol, I think in this story is actually quite significant as well. I mean, the idea that that as part of being human, we have to find ways to escape being human. And I think that's part of the parody of the story.
Yeah, and to me it really matters that it's ad lo yada, that it's not between that it is between Haman and Mordechai, but we're not ever going to lose the distinction about Esther. Meaning, there are clear heroic moves in this world, and there are complexities. And I think that it's important that we are able to reserve that sense that actually there is a hero of Purim, and that hero of Purim is someone who it's not that we're just saying we should do this and look at all of our heroes and find all of their flaws in every way. And Esther certainly did have flaws, but she acted really above board for her people when it really mattered. And we ought not get confused that there is right and there is wrong, but rather that we ought to be careful where we are on the spectrum when we're in the middle.
In principle, I agree with you, but at the end of the story, and then perhaps you're the most expert here, or you have the power of having the book with you, but I believe that the one who decides that Haman's siblings get killed is Esther.
Is Esther? Yes, that's correct.
So I'm not so sure so much, that she's...
Look, I here's what I will say in a totally non-apologetic way, if I can, which is that I really do believe that the kind of moral codes that were understood and taken for granted within that cultural context were very different than the cultural context that we live in today.
So I'm really grateful that we've gotten to have this conversation, and I think it's a really important value for us all to go into Purim with the question about what is moral in our world, and that there's no absolute morality, that there's no absolute right, and that we have to be really cautious in every single moment. Elias, you have a song for us?
Yes, this is Israeli melody. Perhaps not many people know it. It's called Veha'ir Shushan. Let's end on a happy note. So it says, and the city of Shushan is from chapter 9. Rejoice. The Jews had light and gladness and joy and honor. And it's an Israeli melody. It goes like this. Veha'ir Shushan, Veha'ir Shushan, Tzala besamecha. Veha'ir Shushan, Veha'ir Shushan, Tzala besamecha. ליהודים הייתה אורה בשמחה, אורה בשמחה, בששון, בעיקר בששון, בששון, בששון בעיקר, בששון, בששון, בששון בעיקר. I can't even picture singing drunk that song.
Thank you, dear colleagues.
Thank you.